website. If you go to AMSAT-UK.org, you'll find details there. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Graham Coomber, who is General Manager of the Radio Society of Great Britain.
Thank you, Trevor. Try that. Is that better? Yes, that's much better. Good. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. And indeed for the invitation to wake you up on a Sunday morning. I've failed to wake everybody up since I noticed a few noticeable absences in the audience. The title for the talk was suggested to me by, I think it was Graham Sherville, some time ago, and when you kindly invited me, I had no hesitation in accepting. After all, the RSGB should be looking forward and providing leadership, and at the time there was a board full of experienced businessmen, to whom strategic thinking came naturally, of course. It was perhaps with some surprise and trepidation, therefore, that I found there was no articulated vision of the future of amateur radio from the RSGB. There was a published paper about the future of the society and the good things that it would be doing, but nothing about the future of our hobby. Well, not a problem, I thought. After all, the society is its membership, so I'll ask them for their views. And I thus inserted a piece in Radcom a couple of articles ago asking for their views. And I received not one response. So either people don't read Radcom, which may be true but is unthinkable for me, they don't care enough to write, quite possible, or they don't know either. So in preparing for this address, I faced the chilling prospect of having to think for myself. So what you are about to receive is not an RSGB vision, but my own personal view of the future. And I have to put in the disclaimer that this should be in no way construed as official RSGB thinking. Having said that, there has to be a debate, and it has to be overdue, about the future of amateur radio. And I think the society should be leading that. So maybe this session can be a starting point for that. And I guess to add urgency to the situation, as you know, Ofcom have begun a consultation process that will result next year in changes to some of the spectrum we use, and indeed the terms and conditions of our licence. So in developing the RSGB's response, a vision of the future is surely essential. For example, one question to be addressed is the licensing system fit for purpose? Purpose for what future? And at the same time, the Examinations Committee is starting this year a revision of the exam syllabi. But how can you train amateurs for the future if you don't know what that future will be? So, you've inadvertently forced me and the society to start something that we should have done before, and I thank you for that. My first problem, of course, in thinking about the future is to actually define what I mean by amateur radio. Not as straightforward as you think. If I go to our own RSGB website, that's what it tells me that amateur radio is about. Okay, so far, so good. It brings in the issue of volunteer public service and emergency communications, and it is quite interesting the number of foundation licensees who come to us from the 4x4 community, whose motivation is indeed this public service. What about the AR? Oops, wrong way, sorry. What about the ARRL? Well, most of the time it's the most fun you can have with a radio, say the ARRL. Now, for those of us with a vivid imagination, they may wish to take issue with that, but I think it brings in the important part of the idea that amateur radio is fun. And finally, I turn to that well-known source of all information, eham.net, who said, if you were to ask a dozen different amateurs what ham radio meant to them, chances are you'd get 12 different answers. And I don't suppose one of those answers would be high-altitude balloons, but you see the point. So what does define amateur radio? This is just a picture from the archives that we've used in our centenary talks showing an early amateur radio station, and I'll just refer to that later. But of course, amateur radio is not just about the kit. As we know, this is our centenary year, And when we look back at the documentation left by the RSGB's founding fathers, who perhaps arguably invented amateur radio, their definition, or in today's management speak, the unique selling point of amateur radio, was the freedom to experiment in radio communication. Experimentation suggests innovation, doing different things, or doing the same thing differently. And as we know, this approach has taken us all over the radio spectrum, on the way developing new modes and methods of exploiting propagation. What is ham radio? Well, a couple of weeks ago, as some of you may know, we held our centenary day at Bletchley Park, and we followed it in the evening by a dinner. And we had as our guest speaker a chap called Peter Cochrane, G3 RVE, who is a well-known futurist, in other words, somebody who speaks about the future as the after-dinner speaker. And he was very clear. Ham radio is about pushing the envelope and going well beyond what we know and already do. The rest is just playing, fun, and there are more new toys and distractions by the day. So he's very clear that this spirit of innovation that we started with all those years ago is still the key to the future. Although I have to say Peter does start to lose me when he starts talking about smart signal spaces and the like. However, his point about having fun is important, but he implies that there may be better ways of having fun with radio communication that aren't amateur radio. I found this quote from KE9 Victor, who I don't know, but it's on very similar lines. Ham radio has and must be primarily about innovation. He goes further. Once a technology is mature, it's no longer properly in the ambit of ham radio. I suppose you need to define mature, but that sort of thinking would quickly fill up my postbag, I have to say. We can use mature technologies to accomplish our other goals, but we must never become complacent, satisfied that the solutions we have today are good enough for our purposes. And I suppose just one further thought from across the pond on this, and trust an American to tell it as it is. This is somebody called Kelly Martin, AB9RF. There's a reason the public generally thinks of ham radio as obsolete. Whilst to some degree that's due to a lack of public education, it's also because so many hams are still stuck in 1965. 95, sorry, no, 65. It's not 65 anymore. Practically everyone has a cell phone today and enjoys more communication freedom than even the most qualified, capable and equipped ham did in 1965. Your hot and fancy ICOM IC7800 doesn't make you any more innovative if all you're using it for is analogue SSB voice on 75 metres. But I have to say, for all the innovators and people pushing the boundaries, there are plenty who only want to natter on 80 metres or indeed their local repeater. And that is the reality. So, before we think about the future, let's try and work out where we are now. And is amateur radio alive and well, or dying on its feet? I'm back to Peter Cochrane for this one. Never one to mince his words, he said, ham radio is a dying hobby. The RSGB membership only gets older and will never get younger. Well, I'm not sure about his business, it can only get older. I mean, how much older can it get? It's already, it's already ancient. But I think the point is, trying to get it younger is the challenge we face. I walked into the National Radio Centre and it looked like the day I bailed out, I suppose he means, of amateur radio 45 years ago. I suppose he means when you go to the NRC, you see black boxes with knobs and dials, amateurs talking to each other across the road or across the world, just like it used to be. And I suppose what he means is, and I think there is a serious point, certainly at the National Radio Centre, perhaps we don't showcase the leading edge, the innovative stuff as much as we should. And I think that goes for the hobby as a whole. I've just borrowed this slide because this is a slide that our president uses as part of a club talk he's giving around the country at the moment. You notice winning spectrum without spectrum amateur radio is just electronics is his phrase. You notice he doesn't stray into territory that he doesn't understand, like the proper gigahertz bands. I think I can say that because he's not here, but then he may see it later. But it does suggest that if you look at the history of getting spectrum, it hasn't been a problem to us in the recent past. That may start to change, of course, in certain critical parts of the spectrum, but it does suggest that there's plenty of room for us to play and experiment and innovate. The challenge is for us to do it. So, what about, however, people coming into the hobby? Because they surely have got to be the future. So this slide shows the recent examination numbers, or not recent, examination numbers, successes for the last 7 years. And you can see, you can just see for yourself how the number of, say, successes at the 3 licenses have changed over those years. The numbers for this year, incidentally, are showing a similar trend. So it seems to be stabilising, but I can fully accept this is a short series and can't be used to predict the future. And, well, what about compared to the old style? And these are the figures for the last few years of the RAE. Well, back in the day, I suppose you could say the RAE was the exam entry level. Maybe, and you could compare it with the foundation. Equally, the RAE was the highest level of exam, it was the only one, and maybe a comparator with the advanced numbers of today is more appropriate. So it's up to you, but I suppose the conclusion that I would draw is amateur radio is not dying, but it's not becoming hugely more popular. And I think you could argue that the newcomers coming in are just about keeping pace with those who leave the hobby one way or another, and unfortunately far more of us are going the other way. But undeniable, I think, to ensure a secure future, we do need to increase the interest, we need to increase the numbers. So who are these amateurs of the future? Well, one thing the interim board did do was some market analysis to inform the thinking about perhaps our marketing strategy. And this was fairly crude, but they needed to know who should we be trying to attract into the hobby, and obviously by extension into membership of the society. And they found 2 groups really. The group of they called the 8 to 13, the seed corn for the future. And the sort of things that's governed our thinking was previously GB for Fun, now the National Radio Centre, and things like the Buildathon. Again, just for those who weren't there, at our centenary day, we had a Buildathon. We invited 20 children from local schools to actually come and build something radio on the day. And they built a PSK 31 receiver linked to a Raspberry Pi computer. So things we're doing to bring in the 8 to 13s. And the other group, of course, was what you might call pre-retirees, a growing percentage of the population in any of the sort of the ONS statistics of the future. So the RSGB saw 2 groups. And remember, today's new recruits are tomorrow's amateurs. So how successful are we at attracting these age groups? Now, for the last few years, we've been conducting surveys of our foundation licence holders using a standard set of questions. And for 2006 and 2008, we selected 250 of these people from our database of foundation licence holders at random. And we asked them a series of questions, and obviously one is the question of their age. In 2013, we took a slightly larger sample of 400, and that's 400 who'd actually taken their foundation exam in the last 12 months. Now, in both cases, we got about a 50% return rate on the questionnaire, and I fully accept there has to be bias in these figures, because I think there's good evidence to say that older people are better at returning questionnaires than younger people. But you know, within that, you can, and so not saying these figures are absolutely accurate, but you can see some definite trends in there. Undeniably, a trend towards the older age group coming into the hobby. And if I extend this just slightly, because on the 1st of July of this year, we held, as we do every year, as we hold a series of advanced examinations, 7 every year. On the 1st of July, 137, which is actually a record, 137 people set the advanced exam. And this is the age distribution of those who sat the exam. So, what do you make of that? Well, clearly, it's interesting how the younger age group drops off sharply. And I'm not saying that when you reach 40, you stop being innovative. But certainly, the 40 to 60s, most of those were actually over 50. But you do have to say that what we're saying, 80% of tomorrow's amateurs are over 40, and nearly a third are over 60. So, as I say, not saying once you reach 40 you stop being innovative, but it is perhaps concerning that there appears to be a dearth of younger, and may I say more inquiring minds becoming licensed. And I have to say I can't see that changing anytime soon. So, for the foreseeable future, amateur radio will be an older man's activity. Maybe it always has been, with apologies to the few women in the audience. It will still be an older man's activity. And if we want to attract and keep younger people, we have to be doing something differently. What are the new amateurs likely to be interested in when they join? Are they likely to come with inquiring minds, ready to push the envelope, experiment, as we've said? Or will we somehow, or is it going to be up to us to somehow inspire them to do this? And if it's we, who's the we? Again, I'm back to my foundation survey. And one of the questions we ask is, how did you become interested in amateur radio? Now, they could tick more than one box. So obviously, these whilst they're percentages of people who tick the box, they don't add up to 100%. But it is interesting that fairly consistently, nearly a third come from the CB community. Now, nothing wrong with that. But I would observe that, with all due respect, FM and SSB on 27 megs is hardly leading-edge technology. Why do they want to come into amateur radio, and what do they expect to get out of it? I haven't got the answers to that. And interestingly, just before I leave the figures, whilst the family influence appears to be waning a bit, friends are still an important factor. Presumably amateur radio friends, who, on the evidence that we've seen, are likely to be older men who came into the hobby from CB. So makes you just think a bit about who's coming in and where they're coming from, what they want to do. And I suppose the good news is that electronics seems to feature more and more as an entry route. Now, we have used a standard set of questions, and I'm not sure, we don't define electronics, and I'm not sure how the respondents would. But I assume that this includes computing and some of the more software skills. So, how do we turn these people into the innovators and experimenters of tomorrow, just before I get on to the view of the future? Well, the answer that we believe, and I am speaking here, I think, for the RSGB, the answer has to lie with our 650 clubs and special interest groups. And I would include AMSAT, obviously, as one of those special interest groups. After all, where can our new amateurs go to learn, to become inspired and to be supported? People, you hear that we need to encourage self-learning and progression. I agree, but people will need mentoring, support and encouragement in that. And actually, I think that will be an uphill struggle for many clubs. Activity on the air, making things work. Why do I think there will be a struggle for clubs? Well, I hear of many clubs who have really been turned into social clubs. Nothing wrong with that, but the social side of the hobby is important, but sometimes at the expense of the technical side. Only this week I received a note from a member about to give up the hobby because, and I quote, "There's little activity on the bands and nothing is happening at my local club." And clubs and children are also a problem. We talked about trying to encourage the youngsters in, but again this week talking to a club who banned children from the club just because they're worried about some of the what used to be Criminal Records Bureau, the need to have checks against children. They were worried they would expose themselves, and the simplest thing is, well, we won't bother with children. Again, one of our regional managers, he'd been to 2 clubs last week. He's 36 years old, and he said he was the youngest person there by a long way. So obviously our existing clubs are perhaps not the right environment for the youngsters of the future. So I'm not giving you the answers to those, but I raise those as important questions. So, my vision of the future. And I have to say, using some of that, I really believe that amateur radio, we're talking of a future with amateur radio communicators, not necessarily radio experimenters. I think the majority of amateurs will continue to be communicators, not experimenters, at least not in any leading edge way. Of course there will be those at the leading edge in the hobby, and we must nurture and treasure them, but I fear for the vast majority it will be the communication that holds their interest, not necessarily the science. But how will they be doing this communication? Well, with increasing pollution of the HF and VH spectrum in the suburban environment, and increasing intolerance to amateur-initiated EMC, many amateurs simply give up, and we know that now. As many of us get older, most of us will eventually lose the ability to maintain an amateur radio station. Interestingly, this week we were asked to help a new intermediate licensee who couldn't even quite sort his license out with Ofcom, never mind maintain a station. He was 89 years old and disabled, just taken his intermediate license. Great. But also, as many young and indeed not so young people are unsure whether they can afford or want to make the commitment of building or buying their own amateur station, and I regularly receive correspondence from new amateurs complaining about the cost of equipment. Well, comprehensive remote control of amateur radio station is not only possible but also affordable. Technology has now advanced where this is, as I say, where it's not only possible but affordable, and not just the checkbook timeshare, as you might describe recently in an article in QST, which is only open for very few, but equipment within the range of the average local radio club. It's also now possible to engage in many of the most advanced aspects of the hobby, including Earth-Moon-Earth communications, using a remote amateur station. At the moment, remote stations tend to be limited to one user at a time. However, a small advance in the technical capability and agreement on licensing conditions with Ofcom should make multi-user club stations possible. A multi-user station could open up the world of amateur radio for those either unable to put up antennas, or indeed those in retirement homes, newcomers, without them having to put up their own radio station. It's easy to envisage a radio club where the station is serviced by the able-bodied, technically capable members, but also supporting a large number of disabled members, for example. A further small development of the technology could enable remote operation under remote supervision of a local licensed amateur. This could provide a new avenue to enter the hobby for newcomers, particularly those living in dense urban environments. Remote stations hosted by the local radio club could support and develop large numbers of amateurs in a similar way to the club stations in Soviet bloc countries did in the 1960s and 1970s. And here is a picture of that future amateur radio station. In fact, this was actually this station that John Regno, who may be known to you, we used in the Ofcom building in April when we were asked to give a talk about amateur radio to the Ofcom admin staff. And he demonstrated to an amazed audience live remote EME moon bounce with the business end of the contact located at his rural home in Norfolk. And it was very successful. By the way, what I like about this is all the trailing wires, just like those early stations. Well, there we go. And I suppose many of the future amateur communications techniques will come about as a result of people hacking code to run over software-defined radio hardware that plugs into a PC or a tablet. And I suppose this is in essence what Joe Taylor has done with the data modes, which use a computer, a sound card, software and a conventional transceiver. The same needs to be done for wider bandwidth amateur voice, video and data. I suppose a transceiver version of a FunCube dongle or Softrock ensemble for VHF will, for the next couple of years, provide the low-cost hardware platform. We will now need to encourage the software development or hacking to get a new idea of what you can do with radio at a non-commercial person-to-person level. After all, that's what amateur pioneers of the 80 to 100 years ago were doing with the technology that existed in their area. And this fits well, I think, with the interests of younger people in computing. I talked before about the centenary build-a-thon building the PSK-31 and the Raspberry Pi. The kids absolutely loved it. All they could talk about afterwards was the Raspberry Pi. And I suspect if we went back now, not one of them could explain to you what the PSK31 was all about. The sort of things that we might get from this could include composite voice and data tablet-to-tablet communications, amateur TV, but not as we know it today, software-defined crossband transponders and high data rate replacement for packet radio. This could even be used for remote running of an HF system in a remote field. So, to summarise, by no means everyone is going to be capable of or interested in software development at the leading edge. Remote stations and new digital radio communications will happen because the technology is already here or is coming soon. They both illustrate facets of the hobby that's about communicating rather than building and setting up radio sets. We may need the young people to bring computing skills, but we also need to have a capability to introduce young people to radio communications and allow them to use it for themselves. Whether the current license structure does that is another question. The example of remotely using a club station under remote supervision of a licensed amateur is a clear example of how barriers to entry could be swept aside if only clubs have the vision to do it. Leadership by innovative clubs and special interest groups will be key, and I of course include AMSAT-UK in the forefront of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. We have time for a couple of questions. Graham at the back.
I have the microphone.
Sorry, Graham. Thanks very much for that presentation, which at least shows lots of the challenges that we've got, even if it didn't come across with, I suspect, too many of the solutions. But I'm sure if the solutions were easy, we would have all done it a long while ago. Yesterday here, unfortunately you weren't here to watch, but the most inspiring presentation I think everybody would say that we had yesterday, and it was a whole gamut of new projects and just about everything, were two young people, male and female actually, which was rather nice, Mark and Cassie, I'll get her name right today, who were talking about ballooning, and they did a presentation on a balloon launch, or a couple of balloon launches, and the developments that they'd done to get all the radios working and the onboard computers working and everything. And we were mesmerised by that. So there are young people out there. There is a target audience for young people for our hobby. And so that has to be good news. The challenge in the immediate term, of course, is that they are using, in inverted commas, our frequencies on 70SEMS. And I would ask that the RSGB rapidly get hold of that challenge and work with whoever, and there isn't really a UK high altitude society, there is, but it's an ad hoc group, to develop some spectrum management so that we don't have the sort of sad situation because they're using frequencies, a few of which are on repeater input frequencies, and therefore they must be closed down and all that sort of thing. That would be terrible if that were to occur. So can I implore the RSGB to have a positive view of that activity and see how we can bring them inside the tent? Thank you.
Can I just answer to the second part first? High altitude ballooning, strangely enough, actually was discussed at the board meeting yesterday. It wasn't on the agenda, but it found its way into the discussion. Certainly it is a very hot topic, and we know Ofcom are concerned about it. And I think the certain view of the board was, I say, not in an informal sense, was very much we should bring it in, and we should bring it in a serious way, because there are issues. And so I think you're pushing at an open door there. I think we're very interested to know how it goes. Just in terms of the people you had yesterday, can I just ask, how old were those two people, roughly?
Younger than Graham. Probably mid-20s.
Yeah, early 20s. You see, and I think that's... Sorry, I mustn't say this. I think this is where the RSGB's gone wrong. To me, I'm thinking that is very much the key group now. Rather than the 8 to 13s, we should be taking the university age groups. The university being in itself an environment which people are encouraged to think, experiment. I think we should be very much focusing our efforts. When I say we, I mean clubs and interest groups on that age group, because I really believe that's where we will get some advancement, and we need those people, as you say, not just to bring back to bring their ideas, but to inspire others. And I'm glad you said that was inspiring. I noticed it is on the web already, and I think we should use that to try and inspire other people.
Okay, a couple of questions from the internet. We're streaming live with Chatline. But also, may I say, I think it's very encouraging to actually see that you're actually looking at this. Interestingly, we were having a discussion over breakfast without realising what you were going to be saying about what we think one of the roles of the RSGB is, and I think it's important that the RSGB picks up leadership and helps coordinate groups such as AMSAT and BATC and UK Microwave. I think that's one of the roles that you should have and drive. Questions from the internet include, will the RSGB be streaming from the convention? This is from HB9DRV, or at least if not live, then put recordings up. Another question from DL5MTO, or comment, was did you consider the possibility that older people are interested in the hobby to keep the 1965 modes alive? That they see that as part of their role?
Okay. Just the first question, again, strangely enough, we did at the board mention in passing the need to have perhaps a different relationship with what we might call special interest groups, if I can call you that. We have a certain affiliation relationship with clubs, but we actually think we should be having a slightly different relationship with people like yourselves. So again, that's well recognised. Will the RSG be streaming live? We haven't decided that yet. We probably won't stream live, but I think we'd like a discussion about having it recorded so that sessions can be put on the internet afterwards. Talk to me afterwards about that. That's very good. And sorry, the last one about people keeping alive the old modes of communication. And I mean, seems to me people will keep alive the modes of operation that they want to. We have we do have antique wireless enthusiasts, and we have antique wireless clubs. It seems to me it's purely. I don't think the society is going to give leadership to keeping the modes alive, but as long as the demand out there, as long as amateurs will keep using it, then presumably it will keep going.
Well, one other comment or question which I think is important: does the RSGB take positive action to support university amateur radio clubs? And I think that's actually quite a very good point. The relay question.
Yeah.
Right. That'll be the final question for today. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry.
Can I just say something on that point, if I may? For all of you who have concerns about universities and the involvement of amateur radio, with the lady's permission, we have a young lady here from India. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce her name, but she's part of the Strand team, and she's taking her foundation and intermediate license. So with anyone concerned, it proves that amateur radio is also working with universities as well. Thank you.
University amateur radio clubs, and certainly we very much want to encourage that, whether that's a central or whether we should use other local radio clubs to make contact with their universities, because I think a lot of universities had radio clubs that have now disappeared, and if we can be stimulating that interest again, I think that's a definite way forward.
Right, thank you very much, Graham.